When we think of certain cities, there are certain buildings or certain sites which are symbols of the identity of that city. In Sydney, it's the Opera House. Washington, D.C., it's the Capitol. London, it's Big Ben. Here in Rome, it's the Dome of St. Peter's. The dome which rises above the city, symbolizing the triumph of Christianity and the establishment of Catholicism as a powerful religious and political force which subdued and in the end conquered what was a universal pagan empire. We don't often ask, how did all this begin? How did Christianity here in Rome emerge out of the shadows into the light to assume such a powerful position? Where did it all begin? Where are its roots? So we're going to be taking a little journey today around various churches in Rome, showing the stages on this journey of Christianity to establishment. The Church of Santa Prisca is built on a site which is traditionally associated with Priscilla and Aquila, two of the earliest disciples of Paul who lived here for a time in Rome and who actually accompanied him on one of his missionary journeys. The church met in small congregations, some of them spread all over the city, usually associated then with the houses of converts, houses of believers. Priscilla and Aquila's house was by tradition on this site, and it may very well have been the first century house which is underneath this church. Now, the government of the Church of Rome was focused on these congregations, and they developed into what were called tituli, titular churches as they are now. And as time went on, the pastoral care of what were to develop into the parishes of Rome was given over to a priest, a presbyter. So Rome had the preeminent place amongst all the Christian churches because it was the place of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul and also the place of their teaching. It was the preeminent apostolic church. One of the ways it was described was as a hinge on which the church turned. And the Latin word for hinge is cardo. So it was seen as the cardinal see. As the church in Rome developed, this title was applied to the bishops of the metropolitan province of Rome, to the parish priests of Rome, and to the deacons, cardinal priest, cardinal deacon, and cardinal bishop. And these formed the advisors of the Pope and the Pope's pastoral council, if you like. But they also had the right and the privilege to elect the bishop. So the bishops of Rome were elected by the clergy of Rome. In the 11th century, the College of Cardinals was officially established, and it was to them that the exclusive right to elect the Pope was given. So the popes were elected by the clergy and then presented to the people for acclamation, which is exactly the same process that we follow now. Now, Christianity then benefited in its early years because of the religious variety of cults which existed here in Rome. It was protected by its association with Judaism. It was seen for a time as a sect of Judaism, but also people couldn't tell the difference between it and some of the other Oriental cults. Gradually, as the doctrine and teaching of the church became clearer to those contemporaries, its subversive, revolutionary message was seen, and this called into existence powerful persecutions against the church. So The Roman Catholic Church, the Catholic Church, is an earthy church. It's rooted in the pastoral care of the people. It's rooted then in its pastoral contact. So the clergy of Rome, the cardinal priests, the cardinal deacons and the cardinal bishops are in a sense regarded as the clergy of Rome. They are drawn from all corners of the world, but their right to elect the Pope and their duty to elect the Pope comes from the association with the pastoral care of the people of the Cardinal See, Rome. So when we ask how did it all begin, it all began in the obscurity then of this little house church here and gradually developed until we see the dome of St. Peter's rising above this city. The next stage in our pilgrimage has taken us from Santa Prisca across the little valley to another part of the Aventine Hill called the Little Aventine. Behind me is the church of San Saba, Saint Saba. San Saba was a Palestinian monk of the 5th century who founded a monastery near Bethlehem which bears his name and which still exists today and which has been in continuous occupation since. It was a flourishing and thriving spiritual and intellectual centre. One time it had 110 cells and 4,000 monks. In the 7th century, a catastrophe befell the church in the Orient. The Arab invasions caused turmoil. Many monasteries were destroyed, and great waves of refugees came to southern Italy and to Rome to escape the Islamic threat. Amongst them were many of the monks of San Saba, who settled here on the Little Aventine. What they found was the ruins of a military barracks which belonged to the 4th cohort of the Imperial Guard. Rome had suffered during the 6th century from the Gothic invasions, and large parts of the city within the walls were in fact open spaces or neglected. So the monks found here a degree of solitude. Quickly they developed as an important spiritual and theological centre. They brought with them from Palestine their relics and their books. The relics were important because they were symbols of the presence of the saints amongst them. The books, the library, were an important intellectual resource in the Church of Rome. Because they followed the customs of the Eastern Church in terms of liturgy, theology and spirituality, they represented another side of Catholic unity. The Church, as Blessed Pope John Paul II said, lives on two lungs, the East and the West. And before the great schism of the 11th century, the presence of these Oriental monks here was an important sign of that unity and communion, that it is possible to have diversity and communion at the same time. Because of their links with the Eastern Roman Empire, they became an important bridge point between the popes and the emperors. Christianity had emerged from the shadows and had achieved an honoured place in the empire. In 380, the Emperor Theodosius established it as the state religion. But a consequence of that was that the emperors began to try and assume more control in the direction of the church. And the stage was set for a conflict which would develop and which would continue for the next 400 or 500 years. But the monks here of San Saba acted as representatives to the emperor. Many of the abbots were sent as ambassadors or papal diplomats to ensure that there should be good relations between the Pope and the emperor, and that conflict should be avoided and communion retained. All of this ended in the 11th century with the great schism between East and West. The monks gradually failed in terms of recruiting to the monastery, and in the 11th century it became a Benedictine monastery. So a window which had been opened on the East and which had been a symbol of the unity and communion of the Eastern Church and the Western Church, its two lungs, failed. It ended. So the window that was opened on the East was closed, not to be opened again for many centuries. Now we're coming to a place which is extremely important in the development of the missionary history of the Latin Catholic Church. Behind me is the church of San Gregorio, dedicated to St. Gregory the Great. St. Gregory's family, the Anici, were a powerful Roman family very much involved in the political and civil administration of the city. Gregory himself, at the age of 30, was made prefect of the city, which is the chief magistrate. And his biographer tells us that he used to go about the city clothed in silks and decked in jewels. But he felt he was always being pursued by God. So in the year 574 AD, he left the world and he founded a monastery here on the site of his family home. And the remains of that family home are still existing underneath the present church of St. Gregory. He dedicated the monastery to St. Andrew, the brother of St. Peter. And it was there that he and his community of monks lived according to the Benedictine tradition. Gregory is one of the main sources for the life of St. Benedict. He wrote a book called the Dialogues on Job, which was very important in the spiritual theology of the church. And in book 2 of the Dialogues, he recounts a whole series of legends about St. Benedict. Unfortunately, it's not historically accurate entirely, but it does give us a picture of Benedict's life and work. The Pope, realizing that Gregory was extremely gifted, not simply in terms of his religious life, but also in terms of his political and administrative skills, sent him off to the Eastern Roman Empire as his ambassador to the Emperor of Constantinople. So we can see that the roots of the papal diplomatic tradition go very deep indeed. Gregory was really the intermediary between the Pope in Rome and the Emperor. And as we saw at San Saba, this was an important role because very often misunderstandings and conflict arose between the Pope and the Emperor over questions of jurisdiction. Gregory did not like Constantinople. He did not like the imperial court with its intrigues and its decadence. He didn't like much of Greek culture. He was definitely a Latin Catholic. He never even learned to speak Greek, even though he lived there for 6 years. Eventually, the Pope recalled him to his great relief, and he returned to the monastery here on the Caelian. His mother, Sylvia, had also embraced a form of the religious life, and she lived as a hermit a little way down the road, actually on the same site where San Saba now stands. Gregory always suffered from ill health. Particularly, he had stomach problems, and his mother, like many mothers, was extremely concerned about him. So we're told that one day she picked lettuce from the garden of her hermitage and sent it up for him to eat for his lunch. But we're also told that it came up on a silver tray carried by one of her maids, so she must have lived in a very comfortable hermitage. In the year 590, Gregory, much against his will, was elected Pope, Bishop of Rome. And that gave him the opportunity to fulfill one of his dreams. In the 580s, we're told that he met some Englishmen here in Rome. The Venerable Bede, the great 7th century English historian, says that he was passing through the slave market when he saw these very handsome, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys, and he asked where they were from. And he was told, they are Angli, they are English. And he's alleged to have remarked, non Angli sed angeli, not Angles, not English, but angels. And he encouraged them to come to the monastery here and train them as monks. Unfortunately, this has no historical foundation apart from what we read in the Venerable Bede. But it is certainly the case that he encountered some English people here, some English men here, and determined to start a mission to this fog-shrouded island on the other side of the world, where the people were regarded as barbarians. As one of Gregory's contemporaries said, the people here are barbarians, for they eat no olives and they drink no wine. Gastronomy has always been important to Italians. So Gregory, in the year 595, sent a party of his monks from here to make their way across the Mediterranean to Marseille, up the Rhone River and down the Loire, on a mission to Ethelbert, the King of Kent. Why was it important to Gregory? Well, Gregory could see that the Eastern Roman Empire could no longer extend the degree of protection which was important for the Catholic Church in the West, especially for the Church here in Rome. So he was looking further afield to extend then the mission of the Church, but also to win new allies for the Church of Rome. So he sent this party of monks, evangelists, apostolic missionaries to England to plant the faith there. Its effect on the English church was remarkable. The English church, effectively, in its first centuries, was a Benedictine church, a monastic church. Its missionaries, because the English Benedictine tradition is a great missionary tradition even today, its missionaries then went from England, newly converted to Catholicism, to take the faith to the Low Countries and to Germany. So English monk missionaries, Boniface, Willibrord, are to be found all over Central and Eastern Europe, spreading the gospel of Christ, proclaiming that there is another king than Caesar. We have come to the last stage in our journey as we've been drawing this portrait of the beginnings of the church in Rome. And I'm standing here on the edge of the Roman Forum in the shadow of the ruins of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. The earliest Christian congregations met in obscure places, as we saw, Priscilla's little house on the Aventine. These congregations were located outside the centre of the city. They were really at the margins of the city. It took some time for Christianity to advance to the monumental and administrative centre of Rome, the Forum itself. Behind me is the church of St. Cosmas and Damian, which was built in the 6th century. Pope Felix IV in 527 took over a classical Roman building, which was either one of the great libraries which stood in the Forum, or else the audience hall of the prefect of Rome, who was the chief administrator of the city. He simply turned it into a church. He also incorporated into the church another remarkable structure which stood in the Forum, the Temple of Romulus. At one end of the church there is the great apse with its wonderful mosaic dating from the time of Felix, but at the other end we can look down on the Temple of Romulus, the founder of Rome. So Pope Felix was making a bold statement, a bold gesture in fact. He was appropriating Romulus, the founder of Rome, and all that he stood for, the genius of the city, universal empire, and incorporating it into the Christian vision. So he was saying that in effect the church now was the universal communion. The church now, in the name of Christ, exercised universal dominion. In the apse there is a remarkable mosaic, the work of Byzantine artists. Byzantine artists were, of course, the experts in the composition of mosaic. Mosaic work was a highly sophisticated activity, and it was as much scientific as artistic. It depended a lot on the science of optics. So the little cubes of glass or of polished marble were placed in such a way so that the light would be refracted and reflected in many different ways. And it would appear then that the light came from the mosaic itself, radiating, in a sense, the kind of earthly expression of the eternal light which dwelt in the person of Christ. Christ is depicted in Roman dress. He is coming towards us striding on the waters. On his right and on his left are Peter and Paul, the apostolic patrons of Rome, and they're presenting Cosmas and Damian. Cosmas and Damian, two medical doctors who were martyr saints, whose cult was established here by Pope Felix. Christ is depicted as coming again in glory. It's his second coming. Romans would have been used to the idea of emperors visiting in state their cities. And the coming of the emperor, or these imperial visits, were described as adventus, advents, from which we get the name of our season, Advent. So here Christ is presented as the king, as the emperor, coming in glory, making his advent right here in the center of the city of Rome. In the 7th century, Pope Sergius I encountered difficulties with the Eastern Emperor. The Eastern Emperor, as was often the case, was attempting to extend his jurisdiction into ecclesiastical matters. For him, it was important that the church was an instrument of the state, something which bound the church together. So it was important that imperial control should be real. Sergius resisted this, and especially some of the decrees of the council which the emperor had summoned to resolve some of the doctrinal difficulties. The council was known as the Council in Trullo because it took place in the imperial dining room in the imperial palace. Now, one of the decrees of the council that Sergius objected to was the prohibition of the presentation of Christ as the Lamb of God. Sergius himself had insisted that the chant, the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God who take away the sins of the world, be sung during the celebration of the Eucharist at the breaking of the host. It was, of course, the phrase uttered by John the Baptist in chapter 1 of John's Gospel. And in the book of Revelation, Christ is presented as the Lamb who sits upon the throne. Here in this mosaic, the Lamb is shown seated upon a jeweled throne, the Lamb of sacrifice, the Lamb who offered himself for us, and who was raised in glory. Sergius was making a doctrinal statement. This isn't simple decoration. It's asserting then the primacy of the Bishop of Rome in the matter of determining doctrine, saying what the teaching of the Church is. Sergius, although he was Greek and emerged from an Oriental tradition, followed in the footsteps of Gregory the Great. Gregory, as we've seen in front of his church on the Caelian Hill, was determined to extend the Christian faith into lands where the name of Christ had not been heard, hence his mission to the English. Sergius had a great interest too in England. When the king of the West Saxons, Cadwalla, came on pilgrimage to Rome, the Pope himself baptized him, and Cadwalla ended his days here, living out a pious and retired life. And when he died, the Pope offered him the supreme honor of being buried in St. Peter's Basilica, the only king of the English to be buried in St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope was a great supporter of St. Wilfrid, the Bishop of Ripon, and it was he who consecrated Willibrord as bishop and sent him to the Frisians, which is in the present-day Netherlands, to preach the gospel there. So in Sergius we see a Greek Pope who spoke Greek as his first language, defending the rights and dignity and prerogatives of the Latin Church, with a keen interest in the mission of the Church and supporting those territories which were newly won for Christ, and proclaiming here in the heart of the empire that there is another king than Caesar. And here he is in all his glory in this great apse mosaic. We have come to the end of our short journey along the historical byways of the Christian Church in Rome. And we've seen how that Christian community emerged from the shadows, grew in self-confidence and in missionary zeal, and so penetrated Roman society that it transformed it from within, making the city of the Caesars into the city of the popes.